Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, fellow practitioners and educators. As being introduced, my name is Mashabane. I'm an architect, but currently I speak here as wearing the cap as president of the South African Council for the Architectural Profession. I'm not going to much repeat what George or Mr. Henderson has mentioned, but this workshop has been long in the making. When I took office 4 years ago, I wrote to the CAA, and I think it was George or Tony who received my correspondence requesting a program which assists and trains validation panels. Several responses were given, but one response was which really impractical to implement or easily implementable, was that for people to understand how our programs work, they should attend our validations. Now, can you imagine if I was to coordinate everyone to attend one session somewhere in London or somewhere in any part of the world? It would be very costly. So it was easier. It has been easier, taken 4 years to make it that easy for George to come over together with a colleague, Giacomo. So this is not accidental. It is a requirement wherein the South African Council of Architects, as well as you know, it is a regulatory body that has been empowered further by the Higher Education Act 101 of 1997 with certain subject provisions wherein this regulatory body is required. But the Act says it may, but that's argumentative statement. But SACAP is required to carry out accreditations of the institutions of higher learning in the country with particular reference to architecture. Now, when that is put in place and structures are set up, prior to being president of SACAP, I've served in the SACAP validation committees. And what came to my attention was the discomfort experienced by the schools when they get visited. Perhaps they think that they're going to be, a whip is going to be cracked and etc. Whereas the Act provides that SACAP, through the Higher Education Act 101 of 1997, is to advise and assist in those programs to enable accreditation to be acceptable and be understood by others. So that's the role of SACAP. And up to a point that the discomfort filtered even in a different direction, where in some educators have raised their voices, and when they felt uncomfortable, they said, why should we be accredited by SACAP? But then you can only say that when you do have a system of accreditation yourself. SACAP at that stage didn't have a system, but SACAP had a long relationship, as Professor Henderson has indicated, because CAA had a system. But this does not preclude that the institutions can have their own systems which can be vetted by other institutions. But remember, you're not private institutions. You're institutions within the Republic of South Africa. And there are governing structures and regulatory mechanisms. At some point, you need to report back to the Ministry of Education and the Minister of Public Works. So those were arguments that were advanced by many when they felt uncomfortable. But then you will notice that it may not be CAA only that has got a system, but it's a system that has worked and it has been proven in the country. There are other institutions that may have systems, but those systems, furthermore, they get validated by other institutions, which George is working on as well, which is the Canberra Accord. It doesn't look at procedures of this nature, but it looks at the systems and its applicability. So it's a bigger picture that we are involved in, right? So I'm not going to be very long and bore you about the legalities of why it should happen. But a few times when we go around, just as recent as yesterday when I spoke to one educator back in Johannesburg, whose son is being admitted to some university and etc., and the standards or the entry standards are not the same. The question that arises is why? For an example, with not making any particular reference, let's say, for an example, if UCT standards, entry standards requirement is 80%, and Stellenbosch or UP is 70%, the question needs to be asked, why? And my answer to this person is that your son will never be employed if perhaps he got in at 70%, perhaps NASA would not even consider that person. They would rather consider the person who came in at 80%, because the risk of 20% perhaps is manageable, but the risk of 30% is slightly bigger. So it is through accreditation of institutions and try to bring them at par and to understand each other that this question gets answered, right? And I've always argued that no institution is better and shall be deemed to be better than the other one. An institution to reach a particular level of recognition, it is not necessarily the educators. It is those who get educated if they put adequate effort to make the mark. With my colleagues, when I started my practice in 1995, I worked for a practice wherein my principal then happened to be a student of Pancho Gires. And everything that was done in the office was, Pancho would not accept this, Pancho would not allow this, Pancho would not do this. And then the question that I raised was that, at what point do you begin to be a practitioner on your own without an influence of an educator? And this raises a number of things, which are not necessarily in this program, which I've shared with Madam Alta Steenkamp. You need to get students involved in these programs so that they should understand what they're getting themselves into. And it's a great pity that there is no student. I don't think there was any student. But I want to believe that there should have been a representation of a student so that they should understand when these validation board visits take place in their schools, what are they intended for? Recently, the CAA removed some of the schools from their list of recognition. And it became an issue in this country. It became an issue because people didn't understand why. And if at, call it grassroots level, at student level, and up to the level of parents, it was understood what accreditation of institutions entails, there would not have been an issue. George, I'm not going to belabor these issues, but the last time I spoke about these matters, it took me 3.5 hours. And I'm glad that I've been given only 10 minutes. Thank you, George.